Supply and demand, and no dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials. And the Millennial joining me today is, of course, Christopher Hopkins, our producer on the other side of the camera. Thank you for joining us today. This is Mark Fisher, again with Mark and the Millennials. This podcast is called Supply and Demand. You know, it's interesting. In the United States of America, I think there are very few people who really understand the simple concept, but it can also be complicated, I guess, in some situations, depending if you're a Democrat or not. But simple concept of supply and demand. Who do we go to? Who is the go-to person to really provide a teaching moment about supply and demand? And why is this even important, ladies and gentlemen? Well, it's important, supply and demand, and understanding it because of inflation. Inflation. When you have an imbalance of supply and demand, such as greater demand than supply, you have what? You have inflation. And we can always count on the go-to person, one of my favorite senators actually in the United States, and that is Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana. So good old Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana had an exchange with the chair of the Fed, Jerome Powell. And Jerome Powell was there to talk about what the Fed intends to do to tame inflation. Now, of course, to be fair, Congress has a role as well in helping to tame inflation. So do state governments. And we will describe what that is later. Of course, Senator John Kennedy will describe it later as well. But first up, here is Senator John. And by the way, podcast listeners, I think we have a series of 4 clips with John Kennedy and the Fed chair. These are really fantastic clips. This is really, truly worth listening to because it's a teaching moment about how the basics of our macro economy work. And Senator John Kennedy is so good at just kind of like phrasing it and describing it in a really simple way for everyone to understand. So first up, here's Senator John Kennedy asking Fed chair and kind of tearing him apart at the same time about the state of the economy and what the Fed chair intends to do. We have that clip, and here it is.
Inflation is just an imbalance of supply and demand. Can we agree on that?
Yes, generally.
And to put a little finer point on it, our inflation at this time, and this is the case with respect to most cases of inflation, demand is greater than supply, so prices go up.
In some parts of the economy, yes.
Right. Now, you're trying to lower, so we've got a situation where demand's up here, supply's down here. You're trying to lower demand. Is that correct?
Yes, while also giving the supply side time to recover. There's some ground to be covered on that side.
Yes, but you've talked about your role, scope, and mission, and your job is monetary. You're trying to lower demand.
Well, I'm trying to lower demand growth. We don't know that the demand has to actually go down, which would be a recession.
Well, 70% of our economy is driven by consumer demand. And you're trying to lower demand and slow the economy down. Am I correct?
I guess I just say we're slowing down growth.
Right. That's what the economy is. Growth.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly.
All right.
So there you have Jerome Powell in an exchange with Senator John Kennedy. And Senator John Kennedy he's just trying to get it straight for the record. He's saying, okay, Jerome Powell, you're head of the Fed, you are trying to quell demand. You're trying to do everything you can to get demand to slow down and to slow down significantly. What kind of demand are we talking about? And how can Powell do that? Well, Powell has the power and the Fed to increase interest rates. Now, you may not think for even 1 minute that would affect you, because perhaps you don't intend to borrow money anytime soon. But guess what, ladies and gentlemen? People borrow money all the time. They borrow money to purchase homes. They borrow money to purchase cars. They borrow money to purchase furniture. They borrow money on their credit cards. They carry balances on their credit cards, which is effectively a loan. All of those interest rates are affected by the Fed and the conventional wisdom that interest rates are going to increase. So therefore, the folks who loan money increase interest rates. When they do so, fewer people borrow money. And when fewer people borrow money, that means fewer things are being made, and it slows down the demand in the economy. That is the lever that Jerome Powell has, the lever of increasing interest rates to slow down borrowing, which means slowing down demand. And the reason why we were going to start out with this, and it may be blatantly obvious to many of you out there, but this gets more fun as these segments go on with Senator John Kennedy and the additional clips. It gets more fun because Kennedy builds upon his questioning of the Fed chair to find out, really where his heart is with respect to trying to bring supply and demand back in balance, and some of the ways it can be brought into balance, and asking the questions, what else can be done? I mean, it seems pretty reasonable, right? This guy, Jerome Powell, is a powerful person, very powerful, and he's a thought leader, at least for now, in the United States. He must have some ideas on how to make all of this better. So now we have a clip where Senator John Kennedy asks, what else can be done? I mean, what about supply? I mean, sure, we can slow down demand, but since demand is really what our economy is built upon, namely building more stuff and selling more stuff, when you slow that down and you slow it down too much, what happens? Well, you're in a recession. What about just increasing the supply of stuff that we want to make, or that we should be making, in order to do what? In order to drive down inflation. There is that. So we have this clip between those two in this exchange, and here it is.
There's another way. The two aren't exclusive. You alluded to that. You can also lower demand, but you can increase supply. Can you not?
Yes.
And that would solve inflation.
Yes, it would.
Now, Congress's job is not to deal with demand per se. A lot of the bills we pass impact demand, but that's the Fed's job.
Right.
Okay? Now, I'm not going to ask you to comment on any specific bill, but tell me the things that Congress could do right now while you're lowering demand, not you literally, the Federal Reserve, what we can do right now to increase supply.
I think the things you can do are important over the medium and longer term, but probably not so much in the short term. But it's things that, like investing in people so that they can remain in the labor market longer, things like that, and infrastructure.
So interesting. What does Powell respond with? Powell responds with infrastructure. So you have Kennedy asking the question, well, what if we just built more stuff and increased the supply of stuff? So that way, supply equaled demand, and therefore you wouldn't need prices to go up because there was a balance again. You didn't have too many people wanting the same thing and not enough of that thing, which results in inflation. Instead, you just increase the supply. And what does Jerome Powell respond to that? How does he respond? He says, well, there's infrastructure, like the infrastructure bill. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the infrastructure bill does what? It spends more money. It's injecting more cash into the economy, which means there's more liquidity in the economy, more cash into the economy, same thing, which means that there will be more people chasing fewer goods. And that means the federal government, which is now allegedly building things in the infrastructure bill, is competing with the private sector, which also wants to build things. And the federal government is crowding out the private sector for a limited number of resources, causing inflation again. So once again, you hear the Fed chair on the one hand, he's right. We have a problem in the United States with supply and demand, and he's right that interest rates have been low for far too long, but he's kept them there It's only after we had massive inflation that he decided to increase interest rates. So he's certainly in part responsible for it. And now he's saying, well, we just need more government spending. So John Kennedy was going to have none of that. And he talks about some of the things that would potentially solve inflation in the short term, because that's what really matters is the short term. Like right now, how do I afford things right now? Because right now is what matters. So we have that next clip, and here it is.
What about if we reduce the regulatory burden, let's say on refineries, wouldn't that incent refineries to start refining more and help on the supply side?
I would say anything that could increase capacity on that front could have a...
Yeah, but would that help? I'm not trying to get you to endorse legislation. Look, Mr. Chairman, we got a hell of a mess here.
So, look, Mr. Chairman, we've got to handle the mess here. He's right. There's a huge mess in the economy with inflation. And John Kennedy's point is, well, is one solution to increasing the supply, by the way, could be the supply of anything, but the supply of one particular commodity, which is oil and gas, is one solution to create a policy-making bill that would implement fewer regulations on oil refineries. In other words, lessen the regulation so that we can actually have refineries built in the United States, modern refineries, the cleanest and most advanced refineries available to mankind. Wouldn't that help out with supply? Wouldn't that help out, like in the short term right now, if we lessen the regulation so that we can increase and inject a lot more oil and gas into our economy? And of course, Jerome Powell is like, well, I don't really want to comment on that because, I'm not really a policymaker, so I don't really want to comment on that. I only want to create a policy that causes people to be able to buy less stuff because that's all that he can technically do. Jerome Powell, since he's not an elected official, he can't pass laws to lessen regulation. But you know what he could do? He could say, look, ladies and gentlemen, we have inflation that's through the roof. And my suggestion to Congress is, in addition to what I, Jerome Powell, am doing, Congress could do the following things. It could spend less money, inject less money into the economy. It could delay the implementation of some of the bills that it's already passed. Congress could, for example, lessen the regulation on oil and natural gas refineries. Why refineries? Because refineries are what convert crude oil into gasoline that you can actually use for things, airplanes, cars, trucks, etc. Makes perfect sense to me, right? But naturally, since Jerome Powell is a lefty and is part of the Biden administration, he's really not interested in increasing supply so that supply and demand come back into balance. He just wants to quell demand so that you become poorer. And by the way, and he's in large part caused this. He's not the only person, but he's caused this, as I said before, because he kept he kept interest rates to near zero. When you make borrowing costs so cheap, and I know it's great when you buy a house and all that stuff, and we all want, cheap loans, why wouldn't we? But when you do that for so long, naturally, you get to a situation where you have an imbalance and the demand far out paces the supply. So Senator John Kennedy finally gets to the thesis of his conversation with Jerome Powell. The central point of John Kennedy's exchange with Jerome Powell is, well, what about if we just froze spending? What about if government just froze spending? Because after all, you and I are having to freeze our spending because of inflation. Why shouldn't government, do the same thing? And he's asking Jerome Powell. We had this exchange, and here it is.
Now, other than relieving regulatory burden, let me put it in the form of a question. What if the United States Congress said, look, we've got a budget. We're going to freeze spending. We're going to stop injecting more money into the economy. We're going to freeze spending until Powell can get control on the demand side. Would that help?
You know, I feel like giving you advice on what to do when
I'm asking
we're not
for it.
getting
I welcome it.
we're not getting our own job done. I feel like maybe a better thing to do would be for us to get our house in order and do the job you've assigned us.
Well, let me put it another way. Let's suppose, forget about Congress. Let's suppose that every governor in every state and every legislature in every state got together tomorrow and said, I know it's not likely to happen, and said, we are going to freeze our budgets. We're not going to spend a penny more than's already budgeted. Would that help?
Would it help?
Sir?
Would it help with?
Would it help reduce inflation?
It would depend on. It might, but I mean, it would take. Again, I'm giving you. I'm scoring fiscal policy.
Look, ladies and gentlemen, this man is supposed to be a true thought leader. This man being Jerome Powell. Okay, he's supposed to be a true genius and thought leader on the economy, and his job, his sole job at this particular moment in American history, is to tame inflation. And we know with John Kennedy's great explanation that we can tame inflation by limiting the demand and quelling and quashing the demand so that you don't buy anything anymore. And we would do that by increasing interest rates, or that we could increase the supply and the supply of products, that is. And what John Kennedy's point is, well, doesn't government have a role in making sure that it lives within its means to slow down the demand? Because government is spending all this money, which means when it spends money, it's buying stuff and it's competing with you for the same stuff. Okay, so that's literally what is happening in the United States of America. So John Kennedy says to Jerome Powell, well, what if every state in the country, all 50 states, froze their budgets today and didn't spend an additional dime other than having to fund their essential needs in the states? Just stopped all other spending, stopped all excess spending. Wouldn't that have an impact on the economy? And wouldn't that cause less liquidity into the economy? In other words, wouldn't that help stop and slow down inflation? And Jerome Powell is like, I'm not really sure. Yeah, I mean, maybe it might have a slow effect, but maybe. This is the same guy that just said in the same exchange that the infrastructure bill was a good thing. All of the spending by the federal government is a good thing, which has caused inflation and is causing inflation to worsen. Look, the policies, the regulations, the anti-gasoline and anti-oil policies of the Biden administration, that is causing inflation. In fact, it's causing hyperinflation. The spending by the Biden administration is causing inflation. And so the only person that is trying to tighten their belt, to be fair at this particular point, is Jerome Powell. We have to be fair to him in that way. He's trying to tighten the belt of the government by increasing interest rates. The problem is interest rates are having to go up much higher than they normally would and much faster than they normally would because government has spent so much money. And it continues to do so. So you have John Kennedy saying, well, we have a supply problem and we have a demand problem. John Kennedy's point is, if we increase supply, we won't have inflation. And inflation will slow down and will come back to a much reasonable level for the American people. And Jerome Powell's like, well, that's not really the issue. That's not really the issue. I mean, we have a demand issue. The American people are just, it's their problem. American people are just buying too much stuff. So this is Democrat Economics 101. When you have a federal government run by the Democrat Party that doesn't believe in the American middle class. They don't believe in the American people because the middle class, let's face it, they're the ones who are getting squeezed. Yes, the poor are getting squeezed. We all know that. But the middle class, these are the folks who are getting up every day, doing the right things, working really hard. And yes, there are plenty of working poor who are doing the same thing. All right? To be fair, that is true. But these are the people that are being affected the most because their standard of living is decreasing because you have inflation at 8% and probably higher, at least by this point. And then if that were not enough, ladies and gentlemen, just to show you what a tool the Biden administration really has become as it relates to the economy and supply and demand. The Fed chair, he's, Jerome Powell, he was up there, and you have a conversation with the other U.S. senator from Louisiana. So that other U.S. senator from Louisiana is Senator Bill Hagerty, who's also Republican from the state of Louisiana. And Bill Hagerty also has his opportunity to ask Jerome Powell questions. The difference is Hagerty was responding to a tweet by Biden that was just sent out yesterday, by the way. And the tweet, here's the tweet. This is from President Biden, ladies and gentlemen. Biden tweets out, quote, "I'm doing everything I can to blunt the Putin price hike and bring down the cost of gas and food. I led the world to coordinate the largest release from global oil reserves in history, and I'm working to get 20 million tons of grain out of the Ukraine to help bring down prices." So that's from President Biden, okay? He's still blaming Putin for food prices, and he's blaming Putin for gasoline prices, ladies and gentlemen, the president of the United States. So we have an exchange between Bill Hagerty, the senator, the other senator from Louisiana, and Jerome Powell of the Fed. It's a short one, but it's pretty darn funny, and here it is.
Given how inflation has escalated over the past 18 months, would you say that the war in Ukraine is the primary driver of inflation in America?
No, inflation was high before, certainly before the war in Ukraine broke out.
So at least we have Jerome Powell being honest there, okay? At least we have Jerome Powell saying no, but he says it really fast. Did you notice? Well, no, inflation was really, it's really a problem actually before this all happened, because he wants to just get that out of the way, but it misses the point, right? Inflation was already occurring at a very high rate prior to the invasion of Putin of the Ukraine. It was already occurring. So it was already a problem, and it was a problem because of the policy decisions of the Biden administration. And those policy decisions limited the supply of gasoline and have, for whatever reason, and this is, kind of an interesting aside, also resulted in massive food shortages. And therefore, obviously, in addition to the food shortages, naturally you have to use energy to be able to grow the food and to transport the food. So that hasn't helped either. But you have Biden saying that the food shortages are because of the Ukraine, because Putin went there, and because of the Ukraine, because Putin is in the Ukraine. And keep in mind, we've spoken about this before, ladies and gentlemen, you do realize that we were energy independent under the previous president, under President Trump, and we were also not as dependent on food. And we do have to research this too, actually, with Mark and the Millennials, Chris, to find out, at what point did we become dependent on so many other countries for food? I mean, because it just seems really weird. We are the country that's always fed the rest of the world, and then suddenly we're importing wheat,
And all this land being bought up.
Yes, and
buildings being burned down.
And Chris brought up a good point. All the land being brought up.
There's here in Maryland's the chicken capital of the world. The government's going around telling farmers to shut down all their, kill all the chickens.
To kill all the chickens because there is an alleged outbreak of some sort of avian flu. Yeah, and then in addition to that, you have massive tracts of farmland being purchased, again, by Bill Gates. Ladies and gentlemen, yes, we've spoken about this before, but there's a new story. The Attorney General in a state, guess which one, intervenes after Bill Gates buys a massive amount of farmland in North Dakota. So this is a brand new story. The Office of the Attorney General of North Dakota sent a letter Tuesday asking Red River Trust, a group which ties to billionaire Bill Gates, to prove the company's use of the land does not violate the state's corporate farming laws. The trust had acquired 6 parcels of land in Pembina County. I've gotten a big earful on this from clear across the state. It's not even from that neighborhood, Agricultural Commissioner Doug Goering, according to Valley News Live, said, quote, "Those people are upset, but there are others that are just livid about this." The letter stipulated that under North Dakota law, there are certain limitations on the ability of trusts to own farmland or ranch land. Quote, "The corporate or limited liability company farming law has certain exceptions, such as permitting registered family farms or allowing the use of the land for business purposes," the letter continued. And the issue, of course, is that that law is in place so that you don't have a concentration of land by like one major humongous landowner like Bill Gates. And folks, why does this matter? It matters because what the heck is Bill Gates up to? Why is he buying all this farmland? And also, the food processing plants in the United States, separate from Bill Gates, mysteriously have been having fires. So many of them have had like mysterious fires. You know, they're mysteriously burning down. So many of them, obviously not all. And then we had a few of them where there were small plane crashes inside of all places, food processing plants, combined with Bill Gates, who's buying all this farmland. And then we have inflation in food and then a lack of supply in food. You know, it's one thing to have inflation of food, but then you say, this is the United States. I thought we fed the rest of the world. How can there not be enough of it? So no one in the government and no writer in journalism has really explained this phenomenon. That is to say, they haven't explained the phenomenon of the lack of supply. They just say, oh, it was a pandemic. I'm not buying it. I'm just not. I don't think you're buying it either out there in podcast land. And so I ask you the question about Bill Gates. Couldn't a concentration of farm ownership alter and control maybe the supply of food? Isn't that a dangerous thing? And so, you know, you have North Dakota, of course, in this particular case, that has decided that it's not going to tolerate the concentration of ownership. And here's why that matters. It matters not just because you don't want farm ownership and the concentration of it to alter the supply of food and or control the supply of food, but you also don't want a massive financial company like BlackRock to create a fund that then starts to buy farmland across the United States. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, what couldn't someone or some organization with massive wealth not buy? And that is a danger when you have a person who has massive wealth, but at the same time does not necessarily or is not necessarily transparent with what they're truly up to. Why then, ladies and gentlemen, hasn't the mainstream media, why hasn't the alternative media, why hasn't anyone asked Bill Gates point blank? Why haven't people, when they see him, I mean, I'm sure he's a hermit, which is probably why it's hard to get to him, but at some point he has to come out and play and ask him, hey, Bill Gates, why are you buying all this land? What is the true purpose? I mean, certainly not an accident that you're buying this land and you're buying it through trusts to hide the true ownership. Why are you buying it? What are you up to? What are you trying to accomplish? I think that is a perfectly fair question to ask, yet nobody's asking it. Nobody. And so the supply and demand of oil and gas and natural gas is being hurt because of the policies of the Biden administration. And at the same time, we have a supply and demand issue with food, a country that once fed the world, as we always used to say, that suddenly has high prices in food and empty shelves in some situations, and then the threat of empty shelves, because you read stories about this here and there, and then you have Bill Gates buying all this farmland, and then you have food processing plants getting hit by small planes. I mean, this is just weird stuff. And is it connected? You know me, Mark Fisher. I try to come up with stories that are interesting, but try to really stay on track of the truth. And it is awfully difficult, I have to admit, on these stories to not try to connect them and say, this is just weird and something is not right. And we will leave it at that until somebody finally interviews Bill Gates and the mainstream media finally grows some and goes up there and starts asking the real questions of Joe Biden and of the Democrats, and asking maybe the Department of Agriculture. Like, why not ask the appointees, the Biden appointees, or maybe even just the rank and file people at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, what is going on? Here's a good question. Are we still food self-sufficient? Do we have food autarky in the United States? And ask the experts in the USDA about that. Ask the experts at the USDA about the food processing plants and the attacks on them. What is really happening? Why were so many closed down? Why is there a baby food shortage at the same time all this is happening? So we have the avian flu, food processing plants being attacked, and then we have baby formula. We don't have enough of that. Then we have fires at food processing plants. Then we have Bill Gates buying all this land. And we have inflation and a lack of supply of food. We'll just leave it there, and you can draw your own conclusion. But I have to say this. There will be more stories about this to follow, because certainly at some point one day we're going to find out potentially that there's more here. And I sure would like to know what that more is. I don't have the answer at this time. When we get it, we will talk about it. So next up, podcast listener, Kamala Harris is marked down. She's marked down. You won't believe this story. This is really funny. The Democrat National Committee is slashing the price of a Kamala Harris photo op, and it sparked some mockery on Twitter. So get this. Twitter had a field day with the news that the Democrat National Committee, the DNC, was slashing the hefty price tag for a photo op with Vice President Kamala Harris. Harris was slated to appear at the DNC's Women's Leadership Forum this year as a headliner with a reported $15,000 price tag for a photo with the vice president. Yes, you heard that correctly. To get a photo with the vice president, you had to write a fat check for $15,000. And then that money that you were spending, the $15K, would be given to the Democrat National Committee Women's Leadership Forum, which is another way of saying the DNC is going to use it to elect more Democrats. The event ended up not selling enough tickets and was postponed, along with the 5-figure price tag for donors to have their picture taken with a sitting public servant. However, those who want a picture with Harris at an upcoming DNC fundraiser can now reportedly do so at a fraction of the price. Quote, DNC is slashing prices for a photo with Kamala Harris. Tickets for a photo with the VP at the Women's Leadership Forum started at $15,000, but it failed to sell enough tickets and is being postponed. VP's June fundraiser in Cali is charging $5,000 for a photo. Puck's Tara Palmieri tweeted Tuesday. So it's only going to cost you $5K. So Kamala's been marked down. She's been marked down. And you'll love this part. At a time of record high inflation, with prices soaring across the board, critics had fun with the notion that the only thing that has gotten cheaper during the economic crisis is a photo op with the Vice President of the United States. Quote, we found one area seemingly immune to inflation, Bloomberg opinion writer Robert A. George reacted. Nice to know that even with inflation, some stuff is getting cheaper, podcast Noam Blum tweeted. So Kamala has been marked down, and I think that Senator John Kennedy's example of supply and demand applies here, right? There's an endless supply of Kamala Harris so that you can have your picture taken with her, but there is very little demand from the people who want to have a picture taken with Kamala Harris. And there's another lesson in supply and demand. The one thing that you don't have to worry about that's getting more expensive, and that's Kamala Harris has been marked down. Next up, podcast listeners, we have welcome to dystopian California. Bees are considered fish in California. So welcome to dystopian California. Bees are now fish. This is the New York Post, okay? In the New York Post. In an only in California decision, an appeals court, of course it's a court, by the way, always a court making law. An appeals court in the Golden State of California has ruled that some types of bees are now legally considered to be fish. The head-scratching decision by the Court of Appeals has hailed by proponents as a win for the bumblebees. What did you say, Chris?
It sounds like satire. It sounds like you're reading a satire article.
It's like the Babylon bee,
Yeah.
right? The Babylon bumblebee,
Babylon fish.
The Babylon fish. The head-scratching decision by the Court of Appeals in California was hailed by proponents as a win for bumblebees. It reversed a lower court's ruling in favor of agricultural interests who argued the state's Endangered Species Act protected only birds, mammals, fish, amphibians, reptiles, and plants, not bees or other insects and bugs. The decision was a victory for environmental groups and the state's Fish and Game Commission, which had pushed to list 4 bumblebee species as endangered. The court, in its opinion, gave the commission the right to list invertebrate species like the bees as endangered, even if they're not aquatic animals. The judge wrote that although the term fish is colloquially and commonly understood to refer to aquatic species, the law makes the legal definition of fish not so limited. Matthew Sanders of Stanford Law School's Environmental Law Clinic hailed the decision as a win for the bumblebees, all imperiled invertebrates in California and the California Endangered Species Act. Insects are foundational to California's agricultural production and healthy ecosystems, he told Reuters. Sanders' clients, the Xerces Society of Invertebrate Conservation, Defenders of Wildlife, and the Center for Food Safety petitioned the Fish and Game Commission in 2018 to add Crotch's bumblebee, Franklin's bumblebee, and Suckley cuckoo bumblebee and western bumblebee to the state's endangered species. And the way they did that was, as you just heard, a court, okay, not a legislature. What? The court decided they're actually fish. They're actually fish. Bees are fish. The commission designated the 4 as candidate species, providing them interim protections while considering whether to classify them as endangered. However, the Almond Alliance of California, the California Farm Bureau Federation, and 5 other agricultural groups filed a lawsuit in Sacramento County Superior Court in a bid to clarify that it does not protect insects. In 2020, the Superior Court ruled the law's reference to invertebrates had to be read in context and included only aquatic animals. Paul Weiland of Nossaman, lead counsel for the agricultural group, said his clients are disappointed and reviewing their legal options. And by the way, this was also in Fox News as well, not just the New York Post, and obviously in plenty of other California papers. But you notice how you never read this? It's like this is one of those articles you just never read because you think that, well, it's not really going to affect me because, and here's the thing, ladies and gentlemen, the same judges, of course, who think it's okay to classify bees as fish are just like the same people in California who think that men can become women and women can become men and that your pronouns should be they or their, even though you're a one person. It's like, no, you're either over there, but you're not there. You're not, that's not your pronoun. And you're not there, THEIR. But that's the way it is in California, as well as in so many other parts of the country, because, bees can be fish and men can be women. I mean, why not? What's next, right? This is what happens in Marxism. In the early stages of Marxism, you make the language meaningless by confusing people. And then in the mid stages of Marxism, you start laughing at it because you think, well, it's really not going to affect me because I'm going to think what I want to think. And then the advanced stages of Marxism, people start disappearing and they start going to the gulag and they are murdered because they're not on board with the language being completely trashed and completely being removed. And this is why these things matter, ladies and gentlemen. It matters for darn good reason. And that's why we should pay attention. And it's why we should fight. So next up, podcast listeners, the Pennsylvania Senate candidate, I think this is the same guy that had a heart attack. He wants to empty the prisons in California. He once said that. And this is in the Daily Caller, okay? So he wanted to empty the prisons. So Pennsylvania Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman, who's also the Democrat Senate nominee, who's by the way running against Dr. Oz, has a history of using his office to recommend the governor pardon convicted murderers and has backed the idea of reducing the state's prison population in mass, as records show. Fetterman, who has been Pennsylvania's lieutenant governor since 2019, has been characterized by Republicans as a socialist, aligned with fringe left members of Congress like independent Vermont Senator, Bernie Sanders. Yeah, he's not independent. While in power, Fetterman seemingly endorsed policies favoring the mass release of prison inmates and said he is trying to get as many folks out of prison as we can. Okay, so this is their thing, okay? This is real. This is what this guy has tried to do while in office as lieutenant governor, right? And we have two other stories that are related to the effects, the practical effects of Democrat policies across the United States to let the bad people go free. So in the New York Post, hypocritical, defund the New York Police Department advocate has moved out of Harlem for safety issues. A left-wing state lawmaker who has pushed for cutting police funding has moved to the district she is seeking to represent in Congress because safety issues near the projects in Harlem prompted her to shack up with her tech bro, then fiance, in the financial district, the Post has learned. Can't make this stuff up. Assemblywoman Yuline New, hopefully I said that well, obviously she's Asian. She's a Democrat from Lower Manhattan, told a local publication in 2016 when she was campaigning to initially get elected to her current seat that she headed to the wealthier Manhattan neighborhood because she witnessed a pair of disturbing crimes and fell victim to one. I actually was robbed when I was living in Harlem. My boyfriend at the time, my fiance, didn't think I was safe up there, so he told me to move in. And so that's how I moved to the financial district with him, she explained in an interview with the Lowdown New York, which I guess is a paper. Quote, he was already living there. 4 years later, since the updated issues section for her most recent assembly campaign read, she believes that, quote, we are long overdue for police reform in this country and that we need to defund millions from the police in order to put critical funding back into our social services, education, and housing. Key comment in her quote, by the way, on her campaign website, we need to defund the police. All right? So here's a woman who moved, okay, from one crime-infested neighborhood to a really safe neighborhood, and with her boyfriend, now her fiance, there's a surprise, and was a current assembly member, has decided that she wants to defund the police. And this is like Democrat 101 across the country. And we have another story about the consequences of Democrat policies in the country. First, you heard John Fetterman in Pennsylvania, then this lady in New York City. And now you have in the Wall Street Journal, Ken Griffin. Okay? Ken Griffin is moving Citadel from Chicago to Miami following crime complaints. So get this, ladies and gentlemen. This is, by the way, probably the single biggest story of the week. All right? Anybody with half of a brain would want this guy and his company in their state. And you'll understand why that's the case after I read this. Billionaire Ken Griffin is relocating his big hedge fund from Citadel. It's called Citadel, from Chicago to Miami. The third major employer to announce the move of a corporate headquarters from Illinois in the past 2 months. In a letter to employees just today, Mr. Griffin said he had personally moved to Florida and that his market-making business, Citadel Securities, would also transfer to Miami. He wrote that he views Florida as a better corporate environment, and though he didn't specifically cite crime as a factor, company officials said it was a consideration. Mr. Griffin has been the wealthiest resident of Illinois. Listen to this, ladies and gentlemen. He's the wealthiest person in Illinois. So his departure will hurt state tax collections on both the individual and the corporate side because he's moving personally and he's moving his company out of the state. It could also be a blow to Chicago's philanthropic scene. And this is where we're going with this. Mr. Griffin has given more than $600 million in gifts to educational, cultural, medical, and civic organizations in the Chicago area. Mr. Griffin, who is 53 years old, has an estimated worth of $28.9 billion and is among the world's top 50 wealthiest people, according to the Bloomberg Billionaires Index. Late last year, he won a $43.2 million first edition copy of the U.S. Constitution at auction and is putting it on display at public venues nationwide. So this is a good corporate citizen, at least from the superficial look here, okay? He's also been active in making sizable donations to institutions, including his alma mater, Harvard University. Well, that stinks. Where he famously started his initial trading business in his freshman dorm room. That's pretty cool, though. He started in his dorm room. He has broken records with his art and real estate purchases, including lavish compound in Florida that Wall Street Journal previously reported made up part of a sprawling $1 billion portfolio of residential real estate. So, ladies and gentlemen, here's a guy that's given $600 million in a very short time frame to classic nonprofit institutions in the greater Chicago area. And everybody that knows him agrees that the true reason he has left Chicago, not personally only, but also his corporation is in the process of moving, is because of the inability or unwillingness of the mayor and the governor, the mayor of Chicago and the governor of Illinois, of doing what? Of trying to bring law and order back to the state and back to the city of Chicago. Mr. Griffin and Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, that's that real incredibly large dude, looks like it's ready to burst any minute, an heir to the Hyatt Hotel fortune. That's J.B. Pritzker, by the way. He's the heir to the Hyatt Hotels. And the brother of former U.S. Commerce Secretary Penny Pritzker have had a running feud in recent years, lately over rising violence in Chicago. So Mr. Griffin has been complaining to the governor of Illinois about the fact that Chicago has become fundamentally unsafe, and it's become fundamentally unsafe for Mr. Griffin's employees, who have also been complaining to Mr. Griffin. Like, hey, look, we got to come into the city to work from the suburbs, and it's just fundamentally not safe. We don't know what the solution is, but it might not be staying here. So it wasn't like Mr. Griffin just said one day, well, I'm not going to tell anybody why I want to move, and I'm just going to move and take my sandbox and go elsewhere. No, he warned and talked to and had a dialogue with the governor of Illinois for years, trying to fix the problem. And the governor of Illinois, J.B. Pritzker, Mr. Hyatt, basically said, too bad. We don't care. We're the woke Democrats, and you have white privilege. Coming from J.B. Pritzker, who's the heir to Hyatt, right? What a joke. So here's the thing. Good states that are well managed are Republican states. Clearly, that's the case. And those states are the benefactors and the great beneficiaries of these huge companies who are moving great amounts of wealth to the red states and out of the blue states. And we have previously, ladies and gentlemen, had stories about Illinois where when they had a wealthy person that left, Illinois spends every dollar, okay? The Illinois state legislature spends every dollar that comes in and then some. And they have had a pension crisis for years, and they actually rely on these wealthy people living in their state because they count on their tax dollars. They actually, need them desperately to continue to fund their pension largesse and their largesse in spending. So here you have someone else, yet another person and an entire firm that's leaving. The Wall Street Journal didn't speak to what the overall dollar figure would be and the impact would be on Chicago and on Illinois as a state. But let me just say this. If you are in the middle class in Illinois, or if you are in the upper middle class in Illinois, and you have the ability, okay, which you probably do, it would be uncomfortable. It wouldn't be easy. I know it's never easy to leave a state. Trust me. I have the same problem. I'm in a blue state. It's very difficult to leave, especially when you have a life planted there and you have a family planted there and you have business interests planted there. Very difficult to do. But if you have the ability to leave a place like Illinois where the crime is out of control, certainly the greater Chicago area where crime is out of control, you ought to do it. You ought to do it. It's high time. It's high time that the citizens of this great country leave those dangerous cities, those who can, and it's the only teaching moment for Democrats that their cities, unfortunately and very sadly, and or maybe even their states, are going to have to collapse. And then what happens? They're going to actually have to live within their means for the first time. And that's it for Mark and the Millennials. Thank you for joining Mark and the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Getter, Truth Social, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.